Hi, I'm Whitney Espich, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Good morning, everybody. This is EESN, and this is the MIT Alumni Energy, Environment, and Sustainability Network. Our monthly webinar is featuring Dr. Narasimha Rao, who's a professor, Narasimha Rao, excuse me, who's an assistant professor at Yale in the Energy Systems Group. I did want to talk to you first a little bit about EESN. We are a network of a network of alumni, MIT alumni, who are a worldwide community, and we have expertise and interest in solving the complex environmental, energy, and climate challenges. We want a sustainable future, and all of our expertise and interest may be able to be used in getting there. We have been doing monthly webinars since January. The information is on our website about some of these webinars and how to find the slides for them. The website address is on the chat. I've put that there. I hope you can see that. So okay, it's there. The website address. I don't think you can click from a chat, but the http ees.alumgroup.mit.edu is where you can find most of our information. I wanted to point out that EESN is a network of people trying to make a more sustainable future. We have 3 areas that we're going to try and work on activities in. One is the kind of the techie industry and business model side of things. One is the government and advocacy and speaking up to leadership to get the actions for climate moving faster. And the third general area that we hope some of the alumni are also interested in or would be more interested in are the restoring and preserving ecosystems on land and water. We do not have actions in all of those yet. However, the government and advocacy line of things is being covered by a group with us, the MIT Alumni for Climate Action. There's more information on the website about that if you sign into your Infinite Connection link. So what have we been doing? We've been doing these webinars. We've been redesigning our website. I hope it's more interesting and more useful. We'll always take comments on that. There are sections of the website now that you have to sign into the Infinite Connection to see because they are specific to alumni groups. We have a LinkedIn group. It is hosted under the MIT Alumni Association's LinkedIn group, and therefore the people who can belong to that LinkedIn group are MIT alums. Not all of our discussions and information is only available to alums. So I'm delighted you're here. This is another great list of attendees and registrants actually for our webinars. I wanted to tell you that after my brief introduction, Ramon Bueno has been setting up this webinar and will introduce the speaker. The speaker will have about 35-40 minutes to talk, and then we will have a question and answer period. During the question and answers period, you're free to turn in questions along the way by clicking on that Q&A button in the bottom. If you raise your hand, we would note your question as something you would like to ask verbally, and I believe we'll be able to give you audio control. We'll be able to unmute you at the time. So we are about to launch into our Equitable Development and Climate program, and I'm going to hand it over to Ramon. If I can unmute him.
In the interest of saving time, I'm just going to do a question to welcome Narasimha Rao. He is MIT Masters 96, Assistant Professor of Energy Systems at Yale at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies there. and also a senior research scholar at the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. His work is about energy systems, climate change, and economic and resource inequality. He's a contributing author to the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, and a lead national Decent Living Energy Project, which is from a grant at the European Research Council. It examines the energy needs and the climate impacts of poverty eradication in economies around the world. Professor Rao was in 2019 named New York Times Visionary in some profiles they did. With no further delay, welcome. We're excited to listen to your presentation.
Thank you. Let me just set up my screen share. I'm hoping you can see the screen and hear me and see the slide advance. Great. Well, first of all, thank you very much to both Sarah and to Ramon for inviting me to speak to the MIT alumni group at EESN in particular. Perhaps there are a few old friends of mine out there listening, and if so, hello. Maybe I'll hear from you in the Q&A. Yeah, so I have spent the better part of the last decade studying energy transitions in the developing world, thinking about energy demand growth and its links to society and development. And as Ramon mentioned, I just completed a 4-year project entitled Decent Living Energy. And I'd like to share some of my insights from that. The main message that I'd like to leave you with in this talk is twofold. The first is this so-called climate development conflict that we heard a lot about in the climate debates and even in international negotiations and politics. I think is a bit of a red herring. That raising living standards to a certain decent level, more expansive than acute poverty as the World Bank defines it, will not impose a substantial burden on climate change. And really the contribution to growing energy demand is really from affluence all over the world. The second message, which is less established, it's something that I'm finding more evidence for and still trying to establish, so it's less of a certain claim, that I think that there's growing evidence, including from my own research, that there's a substantial scope for a better life for all in a low-carbon society. That is in where we minimize climate change. However, our current metrics and growth paradigm prevent us from seeing that. And I'd like to show how that perhaps could manifest. While I focus on developing countries for the most part, I think some of the lessons do carry over to the industrialized countries as well. I'm going to go through a bit of a storyline. It's very high level and covers a lot of ground. So please do write your questions in the chat window, and I'll be happy to talk about it in the Q&A. The Paris Agreement, which is our starting point, taking as a given that the world essentially has committed to reducing temperature rise above pre-industrial times to well below 2 degrees C. That's a commitment that effectively becomes law in countries. Of course, the US has pulled out recently, but we hope that may change. But by and large, the commitment is to achieve those goals of climate mitigation, among others. But throughout the last 3 decades of negotiations, there has been the persistence of this principle of equity and differentiating the responsibility for mitigating climate change in light of different national circumstances, taking into account different stages of development. But this manifests in many ways in the text of the document. It emphasizes the intrinsic relationship between climate change action and sustainable development and the eradication of poverty. But this notion of equitable development or access to equitable development really has remained lip service throughout these 3 decades for the most part, really. And previous efforts at defining some sort of fair means of addressing climate change has really fallen flat. And I do think it's not just for political reasons. And so I'd like to describe that. Let me start by showing you where we are in terms of how much progress we're making towards the Paris Agreement. Essentially, we lack sufficient ambition to achieve them. If you look collectively at all of the pledges that have been made voluntarily by countries to achieve towards the Paris Agreement. Assuming all of those pledges are implemented successfully, which is a big if, we would still be on the target for 3 degrees C or around there, plus or minus, with a potentially big plus. What's also interesting is what I'm showing you in this picture. A research group in Europe put together a thought experiment where if you take any one country's pledge as a benchmark in terms of ambition, and all other countries adjusted their pledge to that level of ambition, what would we get in terms of total climate change? And here you see that China and Russia are in some sense the worst offenders, where we would lead to 5 degrees increase. The US pledges correspond to a global increase of 4 degrees C. And the developing countries, it's less because their historic contribution to mitigation is less. So whatever pledges they have are seen as more fair in a way. So this is important to see that we are off target globally, but not only that, the industrialized countries are not doing their bit, viewed from many different perspectives. And I contend that now, in the next stage of the Paris Agreement, the countries are expected to raise their ambition. And I contend that unless we address this equity issue head on again, I don't expect we'll make much headway. Let's look at the other side. So in developing countries, they are grappling with fundamental development issues aside from climate change. They're looking here at energy poverty in particular, where these colored areas reflect some combination of people cooking with solid fuels, biomass, or not having access to electricity. But really, poverty is multidimensional. It involves not just energy poverty, but other deprivations such as lack of access to potable water, to proper sanitation. And all of these require energy. And what we don't understand in the literature is how much energy does providing these basic services take? And that's part of what I'm trying to answer. What's also very frustrating about this is that these numbers have barely changed in the past because population growth essentially is trumping progress. And so we kind of stay at the same general number, except for electricity access, where we have made recent headway to get below 1 billion. So that's the kind of development problem that we're facing. And if we put these two together, I want to present this equity issue that we're facing in climate change, with the Paris Agreement taken as a given. So this is the trajectory that we can expect. Global scenarios in using integrated assessment models have various pathways. This is kind of an illustrative pathway of a 2 degrees C, where we have to have a significant turnaround in our global emissions. Of course, for 1.5 degrees C, we have to achieve that sooner, and later would be a higher level of stabilization. But the main point is that whatever level we stabilize, we have to get to net zero emissions. And that's the bottom line, if we're going to stabilize temperature at all. And in that situation, we are kind of left with a zero-sum game, because it presents, to some extent, from the perspective of CO2, we have other non-CO2 climate forces where it's more complicated, but by and large, we're dealing with a limited budget. And the question really is, when you have a limited budget, it's clearly a distributive problem. If we look at the industrialized countries, we've seen in the past 100, 150 years, oh, oops, my pointer is misbehaving. Apologies, it seems my laser pointer use has frozen my presentation. But I'll just keep talking until it restores itself. These areas over here, hopefully you can still see my cursor, 2.5 billion people whose energy use and emissions have been growing steadily, and we haven't seen a significant reduction of this, right? So the carbon space, this is illustrative, which you're seeing past the dotted line. That carbon space is currently being taken up by the industrialized countries to a large extent. And of course, the question is, how are the developing countries, which constitute 4.5 billion people, going to grow as they need to, both in terms of economic activity and energy demand, and yet decarbonize at the same time? I'm actually going to try and close and reopen the program if you don't mind. Many apologies, but I can't seem to move beyond this. So just a moment, please. Do you see my screen again? Yes, excellent. So let me get back to that point, and I won't use my laser pointer again. So I was at the point where I was describing that 2.5 billion people in the industrialized world have been increasing their emissions. And it is interesting and perhaps a positive sign that over the last 10 decades, we have seen a decline in CO2 emissions for about 18 countries. And that is a positive sign. However, that decrease is half of it is explained by reduction in GDP. And so, and that had to do partly with the financial crisis. And we're likely to see another depression due to COVID. But by and large, to the extent it's related to GDP growth, when there's a rebound of economic activity, we expect to see a rebound of emissions. So we still have this problem that even if we're flattening out emissions to some extent, it still begs the question of how 4.5 billion people are expected to achieve their living standards in this carbon budget. So the question that arises is how much do we need of this carbon budget to ensure a decent life for all? Of course, we don't need emissions, right? The emissions are a byproduct of the needs of energy, growth, and of land use. And the difficulty is that we don't know how much energy you need and how much land you need in order to provide the basic living standards for people. And this is complicated by the fact that the technology landscape is changing quickly. So with the reduction in solar prices, the byproducts associated with energy use is changing. Furthermore, for many reasons associated with development priorities and nothing to do with climate, countries may in fact pursue pathways that reduce emissions. So we consider China's example of reducing coal growth due to air pollution. And there are many other such options where developing countries ought to pursue options that would improve development conditions, but also reduce emissions at the same time. So that leaves us with this conundrum, is how do we share this budget, but how do we even know what budget we need for developing countries? If we take energy growth as our basic paradigm, we would expect that we just see a linear increase of energy use. Currently, the energy demand in the US is approximately 200 gigajoules per capita. Global average is about 50. The non-OECD countries is even lower, and a country like India is at 20. And so if we assume that the energy growth is really a function of economic growth, then the only hope we have is for the decoupling of energy from demand, from GDP growth. But we would expect economies to quadruple before they reach a standard of living that comes even close in energy terms to what industrialized countries are consuming. And that seems to essentially put a lot of dependence on technology and supply side decarbonization. And the larger the energy system is, the larger the decarbonization challenge. And so this is a big conundrum, but the way the integrated assessment scenarios deal with it is that there is in fact a silent energy demand transformation that is also part of the global scenarios for achieving 2 degrees C, not just decarbonizing energy supply. And it's interesting to see this. These colored trajectories here are energy demand growth in different developing regions in integrated assessment models. And the gray lines you're seeing here are OECD countries' energy demand trajectories at those same income levels. And these are the averages. So what this is showing is that developing countries in the future are expected to attain a level of energy decoupling from GDP that is unprecedented, right? And of course, there is scope for technology, for smart consumption, and I will talk about that later. But to expect that developing countries' energy demand just will not peak at all, but will just remain flat, is a high expectation. And so that's a concern. And because of that, it's important to think of other ways. If we think about growth, the nature of growth, we open up a whole new set of possibilities for how we construe and think about energy demand in the future. And so that's where we need to go, in my view. In fact, economists have gone there a long time ago, starting in 1990, when the Human Development Board used the Human Development Index based on principles brought forth by Amartya Sen. It's quite a lot of literature showing that well-being and growth in GDP are not necessarily correlated. Growth is, of course, important, especially in the developing world, but it's the nature of growth that we need to question. There have been studies showing in the UK and the US, in the UK since 1970s actually, that life satisfaction has remained flat while GDP has grown. Pollution is clear. We know that environmental costs are not accounted for. In fact, there's a perverse outcome that GDP increases when you have cleanups associated with things like oil spills, for example. And there are a lot of efforts to green national accounts, for example. So we know that this is a failure of accounting. We also know that life expectancy does not grow at the same rate as GDP. And in fact, there are about 38 countries, I believe, where life expectancy growth has not even correlated to GDP in the last couple of decades. So human development indices provide you a different picture. And of course, there's significant inequality that is masked by average overall GDP growth. So we need a new look. And so there's a whole stream of literature that's looking at what's called environmentally efficient well-being and trying to see the relationship between other indicators of well-being and greenhouse gases. So we know in GDP, we have this linear relationship with increasing income on the y-axis, we have increasing emissions, pretty much linear. But when we look at other basic needs indicators, we see a different relationship. We see more of a hyperbolic relationship where low levels of development don't seem to require a lot of increase in energy. And at high levels of development, it's kind of superfluous in energy. So there seems to be scope for poor countries to increase their level of basic services without requiring a lot of energy. And that seems to suggest that there's a possibility that if we rethink how we're considering growth, we may in fact require less energy demand to meet our objectives. So there's a vast literature on well-being, and it's not something I can get into. This is only to say that it includes many, many different dimensions, and there's a lot of work in trying to create progress indicators. However, what we do not have in the climate and research community is a way to relate these indicators to actual well-being, to actual resource use. So I've been working with a group on developing a comprehensive theory-based measure of the material basis for well-being. What are the fundamental resource requirements, no matter how you construe your good life, no matter what else you require, kind of a universal standard for well-being. And just as an example, I'm showing you the various dimensions and what they entail. These are, in some sense, divided into physical well-being and social well-being. And they include things like a minimum amount of space and permanent housing, thermal comfort. So people need to avoid heat stress and having a certain amount of ability to cool spaces, but also to reduce humidity. And we think about very minimal and conservative requirements for heating and cooling. We think about micronutrition, that is thinking not just about calories, but about diets. We're thinking about clean cooking. As I mentioned, solid fuel use is killing 7 million women and children every year, approximately. Basic services, health and education, and mobility. This is an important one that is often neglected in poverty measures. People need to get around for meeting their basic needs, for going to the hospital, for going to school, and that has a significant effect on energy use. What's important here is not the actual physical absolute thresholds, but the indicators. And we've done sensitivities on these amounts, but the idea is to use a very conservative set of thresholds that define people's minimum requirements. And what we've done is we've tried to quantify the energy impacts of these requirements. Now just take a look at the gaps in a few countries where we've done case studies. And mainly I want to tell you that in countries like India, there are large gaps. And those gaps, as you're seeing in blue and in orange in 2030, as economies grow, far exceed the gaps that you see with the World Bank's $1 a day. And so these deprivations, when considered in their multidimensional nature, tell you a lot more about life, but they also tell you a lot more about energy requirements. We can relate these directly to energy requirements. And that's what we try to do. As incomes grow, as countries develop, There's some relationships, so you do see a reduction in these deprivations, but they don't entirely go away. Of course, if we had chosen poorer countries, we'd see deprivations that were as large or bigger than this. I'm going to skip a lot of methodology and show you some results in the interest of time, but let me just say that there's a couple of years of number crunching gone into identifying the different pathways of energy demand for providing these services, not just the direct energy. So for example, for driving automobiles or rail, not just the energy used in movement, but also to construct the vehicles and the rails, the economy-wide indirect use. This is using tools of industrial ecology. And so I'm going to illustrate an example for India. We did various scenarios. Don't worry about the three different figures. I want to really focus on the composition. If we provide decent living standards in India by 2030, this is the energy that's required in construction, that is, to build out the infrastructure that's required to provide basic services. And this is the energy required to provide the services all over that infrastructure. And this is already a surprise to us that given the large gaps in services, we would have expected a much larger infusion of energy for basic construction of infrastructure. But in fact, the energy requirements are still dominated significantly by operation. And so that was an important finding. Let's zoom into each one. If we look at construction, what dominates the composition is housing, both in urban and rural areas, things like slum redevelopment, providing them with a minimum amount of size. And this taking into account some fairly modest improvements in construction practices that are climate friendly. And vehicles. So transportation turns out to be extremely important for building new systems to meet transport demand in growing cities, for example. And we use the mode shares that exist in these countries. So housing and vehicles are the primary capital investments that we need. If we look at the operating energy, that is, the energy you need to provide these services once you build the infrastructure, it's still dominated by public transit and by food, the food supply chain, both in the production and cooking of food. And so this is the dominance of energy use for operation. And both these together constitute in India a range of 12 to 15 gigajoules per capita. Remember, going back to my figures, for the world average of 55 and the US at 200, this shows you a comparison between the amount of energy that's required to provide basic services compared to national energy growth, which is occurring in this scenario at a very modest rate. And the importance of this is quite significant. What we're saying is India's current energy demand growth is very comparable in magnitude to the amount of energy it would need to provide these energy services, to provide these living standards. Yeah, so this is a hypothetical calculation. And this gap is what I interpret as affluence, right? This is the amount of energy that's used for quality of life improvements over and above this expansive minimum, shall I call that. And so we've done this for multiple countries. I'm going to ignore this. This demand is squeezed even more, as I mentioned before, when we talk about scenarios of 2 degrees C. We've done this for multiple countries, and as I mentioned, with growing affluence, you see this gap increase. That is, in countries with increasing income, the energy needs for providing those same basic standards doesn't increase very much. It does change based on national circumstances, but the bulk of energy demand growth is really affluence. And we can extend this even further. We've been extending this to the global scale, actually, even industrialized countries, and finding that it's the same range of energy where we would find 30 gigajoules per capita or less would be required to provide those basic living standards. And all the energy use above that, one can consider to be perhaps of a lesser priority, not unimportant, but less priority than meeting these basic living standards. So that gives a little pause to think about this so-called climate development conflict, as I mentioned. That it is not this poverty eradication so much that's concern in developing countries, but it's really the growth of living standards beyond that. And that's what I'm suggesting in questioning what we're really aiming towards in terms of our general growth paradigm. Let me make this a little more concrete with some couple of examples. So we have levels of poverty that are considered unacceptable. We have actually calculated that 1.8 billion people are likely to face intolerable heat stress from humidity and climate change in the future. And on the other hand, we have in industrialized countries, in the US, 60% of households own central air conditioning that consumes 3,000 kilowatt hours per year, right? And what we are talking about in our scenario of decent living is heat pumps or single wall unit air conditioners to provide a minimal amount of cooling, which requires a tenth of the amount of energy as central air conditioning, but still provides you with enough cooling to sleep well at night in a part of the house, not the entire house. And so it's kind of, think of it as modest living. Another example is transport. Today in India, people travel, in unsafe conditions because of poverty. And on the other hand, we have in the industrialized world an occupancy rate of little over 1 per vehicle, and you have large vehicles that are plying on the roads, and you see the difference in the energy requirement for the same distance. And what we are suggesting is that when we rethink mobility as a service, right, not just a question of smaller vehicles, better fuel efficiency standards, but perhaps thinking about public transit, thinking about car sharing, because what we require is to get from A to B. When we think about owning a vehicle, it's not just about getting from A to B, right? We understand it's associated with many other aspects of well-being, such as status in society and other factors. And so here we come up with what we think is a decent living standard associated with much lower energy use. Now, I mentioned that technology has a role. So I wanted to, this crowd probably are technology leaders, and I wanted to emphasize the importance of thinking about how energy demand can be reduced through smart consumption. And we also have done work in pushing that to its limit in various modes of taking advantage of shared mobility practices, smart consumption, sharing vehicles, using information technology as a basis to be able to facilitate this kind of sharing, so that you ultimately need to invest in less capital infrastructure to provide the same services. And that in turn applies to homes as well as transport. So using heat pumps is significantly more efficient. Have smart homes where you're able to dynamically alter load. These are all things you've seen before for sure, all requiring a level of connectivity in the home and in the network that is still to be seen, but has been demonstrated for sure in the laboratory. And it also involves changes in how we provide energy services. Yeah? Using electric vehicles potentially as a source of energy supply, having real-time pricing in markets. All of these involve a couple of different things. One is changing how we think about energy demand and going from ownership to services, and using information technology for sharing, and moving towards smart grids as well. So I've shown you a picture of how we think the energy system needs to be rethought, both in terms of smart technology, but in terms of thinking about the end goals of development. And there's one other point I really need to make, because when we talk about climate change mitigation, we need to talk about food, because the energy system contributes about 2/3 of emissions, but about 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions come from the entire food supply chain. And there are equity issues there too. And so here I found this to be a staggering statistic, actually. If you look at the amount of calories that are provided globally, you'll notice that the amount that is provided by red meat, which is essentially ruminants that contribute to methane and climate change, compared to the amount of energy that's used, primary energy, to feed the animals and to use the land, it's significantly different. And on the demand side, we have still 800+ million people who are malnourished today. We have diets that are encouraging health risks on the one hand, but also increasing methane from not only meat, but rice consumption. We have almost 1/3 of our food just being thrown away in different parts of the supply chain. And we have the concern that for future population growth, we have competition for land between food supply, cash crops, and biofuels to mitigate climate change. And to think about the contribution to climate change, we have, besides the methane contributions in addition to CO2 and other non-CO2 greenhouse gases, a quarter of arable land is used to provide that small amount of calories. So diet changes, thinking about land use change, natural forms of land use management, have the potential to increase and improve health while reducing our impact on climate as well. So just to recap, let me just summarize what I've gone through. I've told you that the Paris Agreement, taken very seriously, represents a zero-sum game with regards to CO2, and that in and of itself presents an equity problem. But that equity problem is really confounded by the fact that we don't understand energy demand growth very well. We can't talk in terms of emissions requirements. And we've tried to fill a hole in that by trying to estimate the energy needs for poverty eradication. Energy demand is expected to decouple significantly from economic growth, and those expectations may be inordinately high. If we move away from thinking about GDP as a measure of well-being, there's some evidence to show that we may require less energy. Certainly, in the work I've shown on developing countries, that poverty eradication is not a major impact on climate change. But really, it's affluence that is driving energy use and climate mitigation, both in the domain of food systems as well as energy systems. And perhaps we can start to think about lifestyle changes that can have the dual impact of increasing well-being and minimizing climate. Let me, as a closing note, talk about COVID. So we have here potentially an opportunity for change. So we will expect, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, projects that energy demand is likely to decrease by 6% overall globally if we have this continued lockdowns into the end of the year. CO2 emissions are likely to decrease by 8%. And these are sort of unprecedented. I think compared to the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, this represents a 6 or 7-fold higher decline than what we saw then. However, this is largely from a slowdown in economic activity. Will we see a rebound? And we know that there was a depression of about 25% in retail sales in April, taking into account the increase in online sales. But in May, there was a rebound right back to normal. There is some hope that people may change their habits in terms of telecommuting or other aspects of life, but generally, we're not so sure. But what we do have is an interesting social experiment that we've been forced into. I don't think anyone would have agreed to participate in such an experiment voluntarily, where we have this kind of shutdown. So in some sense, we have some evidence now over these months to explore what has this done to people in terms of questioning what's important to them in terms of their activities. How can we look back and see what aspects of these changes might we hold on to? But more importantly, this is an opportunity. Many have called for an infusion of a climate fund equivalent to a recovery act, where we take advantage that in crises, we tend to have an opportunity. And perhaps the infusion of funds towards economic recovery can be dovetailed with an infusion for climate mitigation. Of course, this sounds very pie in the sky. We have significant political challenges, but at least I'm beginning to see more and more the direction that we need to go. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to your questions and a discussion.
Thank you. That was very interesting. One good takeaway message that I got from this is, especially in a time like this where there's so much conflict and it's clear the issue of inequity and the implications of it, to see your comparison of where the Paris Agreement goals, whether one thinks they're sufficient or not, but how meeting basic living needs for the majority of the population that doesn't have it yet is really, it just makes it very clear that it's not in conflict with that. So that's an encouraging thing, especially when so many other things are being better. The inequity is solving the inequity is whether it's the racial situation we're facing right now or the COVID health and recession. So one question that I had in thinking about those mildly growing curves that you have in comparison to the climate scenario curves, have you and your team or your colleagues done sensitivity analysis to the assumptions in your decent living energy, X amount of housing, X amount of diet, X amount of whatever? Has there been sensitivity to see which of those things make from an energy consumption point of view, have a bigger consequence? And the other side of that is whether you have a sense of which of them are more of a barrier to meet.
Yeah. So in terms of our bottom-up work, so the integrated assessment models have these top-down GDP-based projections of energy intensity, right, reducing drastically. In our work, we look bottom-up at carving out a certain set of services that constitute basic standards. And what we've aimed for in that is to define the most minimum threshold that we find in literature would be acceptable to people broadly on average. And so, if you think about the sensitivity to increases, we've assumed, for example, a minimum of 10 square meters, that's 100 square feet of floor space per capita. So that would be for a family of four, a 400 to 500 square foot home, that was a minimum. If you said, okay, what's the sensitivity if you increase the size of the homes to 1,000 square feet, right? Well, that component of energy use or the energy demand will increase proportionately to whatever you assume, right? The real important question is, what's the composition of these different services in the living standards? And what we found that's most insightful is that the most important services for social development, like health, education, basic water and sanitation, refrigeration, those are very cheap in energy terms. And really what's driving the bulk of our energy needs are buildings and space cooling and heating, although we don't look at heating very much, but it's buildings and mobility, transportation systems. So really the quality of life considerations that are most important are those. So, and it's not that people need to think about necessarily, altering completely, because you can't undo infrastructure, but certainly, these infrastructures need to bear the environmental costs that they're putting on the environment. And so, so those are the areas that we find. So in the developing world, we have a lot of unbuilt infrastructure, right? So here's the opportunity where we need to build housing that's of modest size, but with basic comforts, using construction practices that we know will be less energy intensive. We know that it's a no-brainer that we should be following public transit to meet future demand in developing country cities. It's a no-brainer from the perspective of air pollution, congestion, health, energy use, and climate, of course. So it really is a matter of political priority, but there's a no-brainer there. And then, of course, models of car sharing are extremely important. So buildings and mobility, food, as I mentioned, is critical. And there, the insight that we find, it's not just meat consumption, but in the developing world, grains provide most calories because of poverty. And rice, white rice, is the culprit in a way, in terms of requiring. There are many other grains that provide more nutrition and generate less emissions overall.
It's good to hear. Sarah, have you had the questions?
Yeah, there's some good questions in here. Let me start with a couple of the sort of the innards of what you've been talking about. One of the slides before before early on, you had gray traces and markers about the gigajoules versus the GDP plots. Way back in the beginning, somebody was asking about the.
I think this one here.
Let's see. This was the question from Matteo Sebastian Williams. Matteo. So it was, can you explain what the gray traces and markers represent in the gigajoule versus GDP plots?
Oh, I think it's the next one.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think it was earlier, actually. I think it was, you had sort of the aggregate information below some line curves. Well, we'll try and find it later, and we'll see if
Yeah.
if
It looks like
Matteo
what,
raises his hand, we can have him ask directly. Okay, so that was one question. Then there are some questions here before we get into policy issues. Is whether you, Amy has asked whether you know of compelling economic models that are not premised on GDP growth that will take other factors into account, the happiness and life expectancy, et cetera. What sort of models are you aware of that we might use? Can we use your models? And what are they?
yeah. So on the first question, I do think this sounds a lot like what he was referring to. This is GDP on the x-axis versus the energy use, and these gray lines here. These gray lines represent individual OECD countries' energy demand trajectories over time. Over time, meaning over at these different points where they achieve these different levels of GDP. So these are historical points. And they show you that at the same levels of GDP, OECD countries had much higher energy use per capita. Whereas in future scenarios of climate stabilization, we're expecting developing countries to have much lower energy use per capita than what OECD countries had when they were at those same income levels. So the point here is that to the extent we're relying on decoupling of energy from economic growth, the extent of decoupling that we're expecting or assuming in these energy assessment scenarios are quite unprecedented and ambitious, in addition to the decarbonization that they propose, that they have to optimize for the size of the energy system. So these are OECD countries' historical energy demand trajectories. The second question, are there other economic models that have a different view of metrics? I think there are models that definitely incorporate environmental impacts, so green accounting, and there's many of those. I think even the traditional integrated assessment models, like from Bill Nordhaus in the economics department, have versions that include sort of green accounting of GDP. I'm not very familiar with them, so I can't tell you more about them. I do know they exist. So there's some accounting of environmental costs. There are several models that are incorporating income distributions, inequality, and we have the ability to model an aversion to income inequality and see how that affects your outcomes. But I would say that the overall paradigm is still of consumption and economic growth being the measure of welfare. And so increasing consumption is essentially still, to me, to my knowledge, the paradigm, and that we would have to move away from that. The difficulty is, it's difficult. I mean, what I've done, my team has done, is required a lot of innovative methods in accessing different data sources, because the data and methods today are dominated by the current system. So I think we can move in that direction. We do need economic factors to be incorporated, because one question I get a lot is, what about affordability, right? I've described all of this in energy terms, but how do you make these affordable? How do you need to price these? And I think that's next steps. But it'll be quite a challenge to reconcile these, because they are completely different paradigms in a way.
That's great. Good. Thank you. I think now it's time to get into sort of the other side of these. Our back test is what it shows up on the question. The slippery slope, in my mind, involves the amount of force that governments or intergovernmental agencies decide they need to apply to people rather than using tech advances. We will talk about tech advances after this, but the question is whether how can industries how can governments and how can our policies help us to be better consumers, to be more efficient use of energy? What kind of suggestions do you have for the industrialized world for coming down from the SUV level of energy and meat consumption? We sort of are going in two directions here. There are governments in the lower developed countries who want to raise this and have people think about affluence, and there are people with affluence who should be thinking about being better consumers, wasting less.
That's the million-dollar question, I guess. And in some ways, I mean, I have my own personal views on it, but I shouldn't speak as an academic expert on those. This is largely, to me, a question of political economy and sociology. And what I do know is, from my general reading, is that nudges and price changes are unlikely to have a significant enough impact. And so the kinds of carbon taxes that have been proposed and actually they looked at many countries that have some form of energy or carbon tax, they're way too modest to really have that kind of paradigmatic change in behavior. I do feel there's a role that basic standards can play. Just to speak a little technocratically for a moment, I think if you think about buildings, the amount, basically our buildings, especially in the US, are leaky buckets, large leaky buckets. And having much more ambitious building standards, enforcing retrofits, those kinds of changes can have significant impacts. Those are still not behavioral, but they still influence total energy demand. There is a role for behavioral change through price signaling. I think to some extent, for example, changing set points on air conditioners. But overall, we're talking about some recognition here of the equity dimension, of changes in values and attitudes. And here I start getting into non-expertise here. And I do think we need those sorts of changes, but I do see that this kind of understanding of how well-being can be improved with a lifestyle change that involves less emissions. So in terms of diets is a great example. I think it's quite a no-brainer. I think people lack, it's really force of habit. And those who study habits, I think can speak to that, but certainly incorporating the true environmental cost in theory would help, except I just don't know politically if we can really include that. So that's kind of maybe not a satisfactory answer, but those are my rough thoughts on the idea.
Okay, just we only have a couple of minutes left, although that question was adapted from some others. I wanted to mention that there was a suggestion here about the University of Texas people who are working on similar things. Are you aware of them?
In Austin?
Yes.
Yeah, I do know of some of those, but not precisely this work, this kind of work. I'd be curious as to what the person is referring to. I'd be very open to.
Dr. Ning Lin was suggested, and Scott Tinker. Switch and switch on documentaries.
Okay, no, I don't know that. Thanks for that reference. Yeah.
So we'll have that. Thank you very much, folks, for doing that. The other question that we haven't even touched on is the issue of innovation. How can we sustainably address these development gaps in innovation? How much seems to be out there that would be so disruptive that it would work?
Yeah, I do think we neglect the demand side. I do think smart grids, smart consumers. That's the direction we need to go in innovation. That will make a big difference. There are a lot of market failures with the development of these innovations, and so I do think we need really it comes down to putting enough funds in R&D into these areas. And I feel a large part of the technologies that we need are already well understood. We're waiting for prices to come down, but we just need to create the market. So it's less basic research and innovation to me than really scaling technology, and the innovation and scaling existing technologies, getting them to reach an affordable price would go a long way. And I think that's really my interest is on that end of it. Of course, supply decarbonization and what other innovations in that realm. There are plenty, of course. We may have to rely on negative emissions to some extent, but I think, I would focus a lot more on the potential on the demand side. The knock-on effects of demand changes, those who study systems can understand. You reduce the need for demand by 1 unit, you reduce the need to supply by 10 units because of all of the losses in the supply chain. And so really, innovation on the demand side to me is critical and and it's a lot more disparate and spread out. So it's really, to me, the challenge is the innovation and scaling more than anything else.
We did have a question from Matteo Sebastian Williams that he would like to speak on. So Matteo, I think I just unmuted you. Give it a try.
Hi, Dr. Rao. No, it's fine. You clarified. These were the plots that I was.
That's good. Okay. I don't see any other hands raised. Raymond, did you have one that you wanted to? We have time for one more, I think.
Well, I see a question here from Emilio Lopez. How do we convince the consumer to do the right thing by downsizing homes, vehicles, consumption, so that demand drives manufacturers to change their product offerings and allow for lower energy consumption in developed countries, so that underdeveloped or developing countries can also evolve? So that's an incentive type of question.
I think it requires some kind of tax. I know in Austria, for example, they've considered progressive. Think about property taxes being pegged to your size of your home, right? I mean, to some extent it is in terms of market value, but market value is clearly dependent on other factors. So you can. I do think it has to be significantly taxed, and I say that with strong caveat that you need to make sure you provide the required subsidies for low-income homes, because you have to worry about that. But I think there's no other way. I mean, it's very difficult for people to move backwards in terms of their standard of living. But if it's something that is universal and nationwide through a system, that is something people can accept, like a lockdown.
Very good. There is a RBACT wanted to, and that'll round us out. We'll be cut off right in a minute, but RBACT, where are you? Nope, I haven't got it here. Where to go? I apologize. I can't let anybody else speak right now, but
hello.
That's a good suggestion. Oh, there you are.
Hi, sorry, I guess I was on mute. Yeah, I'm not RBACT. My name is Robert Brooks. I'm
Thank you.
PhD
That's
from
fine.
MIT from a long time ago. This is a very interesting subject, something that's near and dear to my heart. And yes, please do contact Dr. Lin at University of Texas Bureau of Economic Geology. And if you haven't seen the film Switch On, you should just look for it. And it's perfect. It fits totally within the scope of what you're talking about, Dr. Rao. So I think you'd really find it very, very interesting. So yeah, the slippery slope that I was talking about is what I would call, having to do with the choice between two concepts, freedom and choice. I certainly see the importance of the kinds of things that you are talking about here. This is, clearly climate change is very important. On the other hand, there is this slippery slope, which is it becomes so important that choice is no longer important, and it gets much more into the governmental force arena. The question
we might have one.
As we've seen, okay, so as we've seen in the past, that can get into a point where there's no choice afterwards. In other words, you can get into a very bad situation economically and so forth. Can you address this in the few minutes we have left?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy to me. I'm trying to develop the evidence. I'm trying to find evidence to show that it's not a compromise of choice, that we actually can make better choices that actually benefit us overall. That's the one hope. And to the extent there is some sort of forcing, yeah, I think it will be necessary. It's the same way we have reacted to COVID to prevent the loss of lives. I do think there's an element of that, setting aside the political challenges and actually doing that. But I genuinely don't think that, yeah, the more evidence we find to convince people that actually it's not that dichotomy, I think the easier it will be to create kind of change we want.
Thank you.
Thank you for your suggestions, by the way.
We will pass those along in writing to Dr. Rao. We hope to do some follow-up with you and have these slides available, although we haven't specifically asked Dr. Rao for permission yet. Professor Rao, I should say. I always professor better. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and keep an eye open on those Alumni Learn emails every month. We will try to post our meetings there, our webinars, and hope to hear from you in the months to come. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Rao.
Thank you.
I would like to just add one thing, thanking you for your presentation, that those who are from the techie or economic perspective interested in, I would recommend they look at how you come up with your estimates from the ground up on a material basis, input-output models and life cycle analysis, that it's not just some arbitrary curve fitting of some sort. I recommend those who are interested to follow up on that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Great.
Very good.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.